Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue. Today is episode 149. Quick housekeeping note, please follow us on LinkedIn, Identity Office Hours. We're trying to get to 2,000 followers. So please hit follow. Our guest today is Pawan Nallan, CEO of SecurDI. Welcome, Pawan.
Mike, thank you so much. Thanks for having me here today. And again, super excited about the topic. It's very close to my heart, but appreciate you inviting me over.
Awesome. So before we actually dive into the topic, tell us a little bit about your career trajectory and how you came to found SecurDI.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm what you call like a purebred identity or cyber guy, right? I've been doing this for about 18 years. But if I have to step back a little bit, right, I'm basically a computer engineer. And then I ended up doing my master's in business administration, focusing on organizational leadership, right? I started off with, an identity, boutique firm. Back in the day, it was pretty much like Oracle, CA, IBM.
Well, yeah.
Yep. So the whole Oblix core, core ID days, right? So I set out over with like an Oracle pillar partner, and it's very interesting, right? Like so when I started, and I didn't know what identity was, right? So and a lot of times identity was sold as a sidekick to ERP projects or ERP products, right? And then if you remember like the whole 2008 recession and I lost my job, right? Like I ended up doing something else, but I was so fascinated. Something told me that this is kind of where I have to be, because you're touching all the digital ecosystem, right from the center, right? If you are into identity, you're integrating with every application that's out there. So I was always like curious about learning, right? So you get to learn a little bit about every product. Like so I knew more about ERP than ERP specialist back then, doing identity work. So I kind of like kept going back to them. It's like I want to do this, right? So when you have an opening, and then finally they had something for me, and then never looking back, right? So I've done end-to-end identity architectures for commercial, state, local, higher ed. uh, you know I think like the today's teams are spoiled, right? They have an identity team, access team, directory services team, governance team. Back in the day, it was just one engineer or architect doing all of these things, right? But that's where the whole learning happened. um, you know I founded SecurDI about like a half a decade ago, but it wasn't making for about a half a decade in my head. But I came to a point, it's my ikigai, right? So it was something that I was really good at. Something, I thought is of purpose, right? Because today's day and age, identity is everything. 99% of our identities are digital, and they have to be secure. They have to be done a certain way, and leave a better secured world for the future global citizens, right? So it was a purpose. It also made business sense, right? Identity was booming. We all know it's a $40 billion industry now, but also most importantly, it's a give back, right? So I'm a very people guy. So we started this journey called SecurDI about 5 years ago. We are a advisory first, identity security focused strategy and implementation company, and that's kind of what we do. We work with all the vendors and products that are out there, but most importantly, what we do is advise our clients to do the right thing from an identity standpoint.
Great.
Great.
I
I
wonder,
wonder,
I'm hearing a little echo. I wonder, I'm in a different environment, as everyone can tell today. I'm at WeWork. So apologies. I got kicked out of the house today, and my wife's teaching Shakespeare. So too many kids. The topic today, actually, as you sort of alluded to, is the C-suite guide to IAM advisory. And I wanted to start by asking, I was looking a little bit at the background materials and the homework that you assigned, and one of the things that I sort of picked up on was you were talking about strategic organization design. And I'm wondering if you could talk about what does that actually mean to you? Like I hadn't heard that term before, and I'm curious if you could expand on that a little bit.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think the, our biggest problem, right, when we walk into a client, they're directly walking into like, hey, what vendor or product do I pick, right? Or you're walking into, you already picked a product and vendor, it's not working, right? Or we don't have the right kind of people to kind of enable the product's functionality to fit our requirements, right? Or you don't have the right kind of processes to be able to accomplish it. But nobody ever talks about you know what what are your goals, like what are you trying to achieve, right? Like why you want to do this a certain way, right? Like, so if you have a requirement, I have a just in time requirement, which product does that really well, right? Like, well, all of them do things a certain way and do them really well, but why do you need just in time, right? So I think what we really try to advise our clients, Mike, is like, let's organize the structure a little bit, right? Whether you have a structure, a pyramid, right, or not, or if it's a flat hierarchy, but let's kind of put a structure, the roles, the definitions. Who's the C-suite or the business. Put some KPIs there in terms of why do you want the program to be a certain way. Then if it's a CISO or a VP, you know break those KPIs down further down, and then you have an architect and an engineer break those down, and then associate the requirements to these KPIs, right? So that way everybody kind of like sees the value, right, in terms of like what you're trying to do. But the structure is basically what typically is missing in most cases, and that kind of like ends up with failed projects, delayed timelines, finger pointing, or like, hey, should I move to a different product? No, you don't need to, right? Like, I think it's about just stepping back a little bit, putting a framework, right, and putting some guardrails and a process and structure to it, right? So in essence, what we need, Mike, in our world, you need a governance program for an IAM program, right? And organizationally put a structure there, and enable the businesses. Don't look at it as a technical or a tactful or a cost center, but look at it as a business enabler. And then how can you enable your business?
So strategic organization design is sort of a means to building a governance framework for for this identity cybersecurity challenge.
Absolutely, absolutely,
Um,
absolutely.
and so I also was a consultant for a while before I started Glue. And I started Glue. Actually, you mentioned the financial meltdown of 2008. That got me out of New York, and moving to Texas and starting Glue. Um, so I had to change my plan, and I changed my plan by starting Glue. Um, but one of the things I remember, as a consultant, um, was that when you go in as a consultant, there's a whole culture that's there that predates you. That's in a way also. I see the definition of culture as like the stuff that's hard to change because it's the built-in way that people have always acted and continue to act. But talk a little bit about the challenges of that you face in sort of understanding the culture when you go into a new organization. And then if you see that the culture is contributing to the challenges, how do you go about maybe suggesting that we need to change the culture?
Absolutely. I think great question. And if I have to give examples, probably like, I think the next hour is not sufficient, right? But that's getting into the challenges, I have faced, right? And but I'll get into what we try and do differently in the beginning, and then kind of get into the challenges, right? But that's where I like the word advisor more for what we do than a consultant. So to your point, Mike, like, as a consultant, what happens is, like, when you're going into an organization, you're always like perceived to be representing, let's say, a tool, a technology, or a vendor, or a team, right? But in reality, an organization would have invested in a vendor or a product, right? And then an organization would have put the team in place. You're merely trying to kind of come and help the organization achieve their goals, leveraging the tools they've invested in, and the people that they have, and then the processes that they have, right? But a lot of time, you know any gaps in the people process technology or any failures ends up coming the ire ends up coming towards the consultant.
Well, that's why you're there.
That's why we're there, right? Like, so a lot of times, like, we have to navigate. It's like, hey, I'm not the one who's building the product, right? I'm the one who understands the product, understands your requirement, your business case, your industry, right? And I'm trying to make sure that we're implementing it the way you want it to be implemented, right? I don't represent any of these things, right? So I think that's a shift, right? But if you're new to the game, it's very difficult to take that middle ground, and you're trying to do a win-win for everybody and make sure that you're doing the right thing for everybody. But I think, over the time, what happens is, once you earn the trust, once you do this once or twice, you get into the cycle. I think everybody sees the value. Once you start showing that value to the business leaders, technical leaders, vendors, then your job becomes a lot easier, right? Because you're able to steer them and navigate to do the right things.
So you've been at this for a long time, and what I've noticed is like things have really changed in IT. Um, things that we thought in the early 2000s like would be crazy now, and so there has been a lot of change, and there's been a lot of new technologies. What have you noticed about sort of the identity cybersecurity space that has really evolved, especially recently in the last, 5 to 7 or 8 years? What have the big changes been? And then specifically, I'm thinking about like change management and just how this type of infrastructure is rolled out to deliver the business value. And has has the C-level suite really adjusted to this change? And do they recognize it?
Absolutely. I think great question, right? The last half a decade or more, I think the shift definitely happened in a way where they're not just looking at identity as like, oh, for the longest of the time, they always looked at identity as AD or desktop single sign-on, right? That's not happening anymore, right? Like, people recognize the value of, the whole JML process, right? Why do they need an IGA, right? Why do they need an access governance? Privileged access management, really came to the forefront, right? ITDR, right? So from an awareness standpoint, the value standpoint, people started kind of like focusing more. So that means, like, there's a lot more C-suite backing. But I think what still needs to happen, or the gap is somebody to be able to articulate the business value, right? Of why we are doing a certain thing. I think the technology is evolving. The whole convergence of identity platforms is kind of helping out, uh, putting everything under one umbrella. But tying them back to the business, problems or business value or business enabler, is still not happening. The good shift is C-suite is asking those questions, right? Like, but the right answers are not still given. I think as long as we're able to bridge that gap, I think, identity, is slowly going to start shifting from, hey, I need to be compliant. I want to run an identity program, or I need a cyber insurance, so I want a PAM program, to I need an identity program to enable my business goals, right? I want to grow 30%. So I want the right program. And that's why I've also seen chief identity officer role emerging these days, right? So that's a welcome shift, just as an industry.
Um, so in the old days, we used to talk about identity and access management as if identity was an enabler for access management. We needed to identify you or authenticate you because then we could figure out what you should have access to. And there was this conception that if we did a good job at this, we'd be secure. But I feel like what we've seen today is that identity is human identity and human identity management, while an important business capability. I don't think joiner, mover, leaver, it's almost like consider it's basic security hygiene today that you're expected to have. But I'm not sure that we can make that relationship between identity and access management anymore, where identity is context. That is, when I make a security decision, the human identity part is going to be input to that security decision, but it's only part of the input. I also have input about software identity. What type of piece of software is this? An API making a request on behalf of a person? So what's the software that's used? What's the mobile app? Do I trust that mobile app? So software identity has become more important. Context has become more important. You mentioned ITDR that can give us real-time risk signals. And so I'm just wondering, I'm having a bit of an existential moment right now because this is the Identirati office hours live stream. And I'm realizing that identity maybe is more limited in its ability to actually deliver security. And I'm curious, what are your thoughts on this? Does the board really care about identity, and should they care? And if identity is not an organizing principle, maybe there shouldn't be a chief identity officer. I'm just curious where you come out on this.
Absolutely. So I'll probably do it like I'm just organizing the questions that you've asked, right? Like probably two or three fold, right? Like let's kind of talk about the whole, you know, the technical or process question you asked, the correlation between identity and access, and then we obviously spoke about human identities, and then now we're talking about non-human identities. Now it's obviously a genetic identity is a big thing that everybody's talking about, right? But I'm very old school in my understanding of how identity and access works, right? How much of the technology changes, right? What you call it, the basic premise still is the same, right? From a correlation standpoint, if you're coming into my digital ecosystem, you need to have an identity, right? I need to know who you are. Now, you could be a human, you could be a non-human, it could be like a service account, it could be an agent in today's days.
Let me push back on that a little bit. You don't really need to know who I am. You might need to know that I'm a person from a certain organization, but you might not actually need to know who I am. You might need to know that I'm authorized to get a piece of data, but you might not actually need to know who I am.
Yes and no, right? Like I need not know it's actually Mike, right? Or it's 007, right? But I still need to know what's your identity, right? Like your role. If you're a partner company working, using an API, trying to get some information, I need to know who that role is, right? So we still need to
policy. You need a policy to protect that resource.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
identity might not, in this case, I would argue to me, identity means that I have an identifier, and therefore I can be tied to But in this case, my identity might be a pairwise identity. Um, and all you really know is that, and the trust level might be at the organization level. This is the US government that is requesting this data for compliance reasons. And
Yep.
that's all I really need to know. And the trust has been settled at the organizational level. And maybe we don't even need to, maybe there is no person, or maybe the person is just an actor on behalf of the organization.
Or maybe, how AI is trending, it's an agent, it's a delegated
Right.
agent that's trying to do that, right? But we still need to identify something, right? And what is your purpose? Why are you accessing, my, infrastructure, right? Or my assets? Then the going back to your question in terms of correlating to access, then you say, okay, fine, now that I know, right, do you have the access, right? So that's where the whole authorization, right? So again, the basic premise between identity and access and the correlation, they do not change. You may be calling it different things, right? Entitlements
Yeah.
or groups or accesses.
I beg to differ, because I believe the direction that you're going from is, okay, now that I know who you are, whether, even though I might not know your mic, I know your user from Glue, and now I want to know what you can do, and are you allowed to do the thing that you're asking to do? I think that's backwards, actually. I believe that the question is that there's an action that's being requested on a resource, which is what I define as a capability, and there's a policy to protect that resource. And that policy might include information about the identity of the human or the identity of the software or the relationship of the organization. But I don't believe we work backwards from asking, does this person have the ability to do it? I think we should work from the point of, here's the capability that we're talking about, and what are the policies that we have to satisfy. And that's a subtle difference, but it's the reason that I feel really uncomfortable with the idea of entitlements or the idea of permissions. I don't. Those are sort of always imply the involvement or the subject being a person. Where I really want to focus on the assets, because I like what you said about governance. I think the key is governance. But to me, governance. Let me ask. Let's actually sidetrack there. What do you mean by governance?
So before going to governance, right? So because I want to finish that thought.
Sure.
But they're still accessing something, right? Like, how do you determine whether I let them to access or not? Again, you don't call it access management, you don't call it entitlements, but that
Access management.
asset has to be accessed, right?
I'm good with access management. I'm not good with entitlements or permissions, but
Like I said, it's what you call. So that's kind of where I was going with. I'm pretty old school, right? You need to identify, right, human, non-human, genetic, or agent, and then do we agree that you should be accessing or doing these actions, for that particular asset, or you can call that API. What do you want to call it, right? So I think that's kind of how it kind of ties down, right, from that perspective, and. Also going back, because there was this two prong to your question in terms of like the C-suite or the
yeah,
board looking at it, right? So if you're going back to that, this is from a technical standpoint, right? I don't think a C-suite or a board should be looking at these things, right? So that's too granular, and this is where we advise our clients in terms of, especially from a business functionality, focus on your business. Is this enabling your business? Are you able to kind of like, if a guy is on the field selling, is this in seamlessly, securely, he's able to kind of access your assets and materials and able to do his or her job effectively, is what they should be focusing on. And they should leave the technical pieces or the reference architecture to the brains, but focus actually. And so what they care for is that's where the whole C-suite advisory come into play, right? Where you're bridging the gap between the understanding.
Let me push back a little bit on this. Is that now ideally it's always good to focus on revenues and not costs, right? Business, as a business person, if you tell me I can make twice as much money, I'm way more interested than if you tell me I can save 20%. Um, and I get a multiple on my business of revenues, so that more additional revenues is like comes back as a multiple of value. So so business enablement is way more valuable, but I'm not convinced that 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 the C-suite is looking to identity or to cybersecurity as a business enabler. I think they see it as table stakes, that this is something that I must do competently, or I'm not doing a good job governing. My job as a governor is to make sure that we're responsible, that we're grown-ups, and that we're managing all the risks. And I know that there's a huge cybersecurity risk. The media is flooding me with information about really embarrassing hacks for lots of companies. I don't want to be that next guy. So I really think we see the potential for business enablement as professionals. Like if you're good at identity, you can build better products. Just look at Google. Google's done a brilliant job integrating identity into those products. You don't even notice it. It's so good.
Yeah.
Um, but on the other hand, I think, if I'm in the C-suite and I'm thinking about my board, I'm worried, I'm thinking about how do I achieve security. Security is the freedom from worry, where I can be carefree. And I feel like that we're not delivering security, we're band-aiding problems. And so in a way, maybe we're not aligning with the true goal, which of the C-suite, which is really, I want security, I don't want chaos. And right now I feel like we have chaos, and you can't sleep well at night if there's chaos.
Yeah. So, Mike, this I agree with you, right? And that's kind of where we're coming from in terms of the need for a C-suite identity advisory, right? Um, Today, the C-suite is not looking at identity as a business enabler. What we're telling is like they should be looking at it as a business enabler, and a right advisory program can enable build the right KPIs to show the value on how identity can enable the business. Because you're absolutely right. Today, as we stand, they look at it as I need governance, I need compliance, right? I need insurance, right? I want to be able to sleep well, knowing that there's nothing under the hood that's waiting to kind of get into my system, right? What am I waiting for? So that's always been the focus, right? We're not saying that the focus has to shift. That should still continue, but identity has evolved and can be a business enabler, and that is the value that we need to start showing it, so that we have bigger and better programs that are built.
I go to some conferences, identity conferences, RSA, and I see on the show floor a vast array of vendors, each defining new product categories. And there's been a balkanization of product categories. And I wonder if I was in the C-suite, if I'd be thinking that the number of ways that I could improve security are almost infinite. And if that's true, what do I actually prioritize? Um, so, so I wonder if what's really missing is an overarching like architecture and strategy, so that I can know that I have the right mix of these products across my company, and that they're working together, because no one company is a one-stop shop for cybersecurity. It's really going to be a collaboration of interconnected vendors, no matter how you look at it. In the old days, you could just buy Oracle.
Yeah.
Oracle won't even tell you that's going to work anymore. So what are your thoughts about you mentioned KPIs? What are the KPIs that C-suite should be looking at to understand that these systems are working together across these multiple categories?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think the biggest KPIs is the coverage, right? Like for example, if they pick a PAM tool, right? But is the PAM that particular PAM vendor or tool
Yeah.
is designed to cover, all of my privileged identities or users, right? So I think their KPI should be in the form of what are my, what's my user base, right? As we stand today from an identity standpoint, how many of them have MFA coverage, right? How many of them are like privileged users, and is the tool covering all of that landscape, right? I think the focus should always be on the coverage from a KPI standpoint. But to step back, right, and you're absolutely right, from the vast spread of the vendors that are out there, and each kind of overlapping, they're all doing the same things but doing it differently.
Yeah.
uh, but what really should matter is qualify your requirements, both business functional and technical and security requirements, right? And then build a reference architecture, right? Build a technical reference architecture that kind of ties back to the business values, put KPIs for each one of them, and then kind of do a roadmap, right? And also, which also should involve like the seamless integration, taking into account product roadmaps, taking into account, do you have the right kind of people to implement that, right? Taking into account, like, how difficult or easy it is to build processes around it, right? So, and this kind of falls into governance. I'm not talking about identity governance. I'm talking about an identity program governance.
So coverage, I mean, I like the idea of coverage because this is a process. Governance is a process. It's not a project with just one deliverable. And the nice thing about a coverage KPI is that you can show improvement. Um, but I wonder if this is actually like what coverage of what MFA coverage, for example. That's a good one. I recently attended our local chapter of ISSA, and I was listening to sort of what CISO's views of security, and almost everyone got up there and said MFA. Make sure everyone's MFA'd. But as a vendor who delivers MFA, I saw a real lack of nuance. MFA'd when? MFA'd how often? So I saw a disconnect in the theater of MFA versus the effectiveness of using MFA to secure certain types of authorization. So MFA is just an example here of one metric you might look at, adoption of MFA. But what are some of the other metrics? And I guess the question is like, do you think that those metrics actually deliver security? Um, and so if you're a C-level executive who's not an identity expert or a security expert, um, like what types of metrics do you want to deliver to know that you're going to be secure? And is coverage, what else besides coverage too?
Absolutely, absolutely. Now let's every vendor, let's say we talk about identity governance, they're talking about joiner, mover, leaver, right? And they talk about a lot of things under that. But let's say, if you want to put a KPI, something like mean time to access revocation, right? And then you tie that back to say, hey, somebody leaves, what's my mean time to revoke access, right?
Mhm.
And somebody is looking at it, oh, okay, it takes me this long for all of the access to go away. So it gives them an understanding of, from a security standpoint, how long it takes for them to feel secure, right? And then for them it goes back and says like, hey, can this be shortened? Because I have this field agent who's going to a competitor, right? And your mean time is like 1 day or like 30 minutes, but I don't even want to give that 30-minute window.
Interesting. So temporal, in addition to sort of like aggregate, also temporal types of metrics. Um, I'll put my cards on the table and say the metric that I like for governance. Um, the metric that I would like to see is percentage of policies that you can reason over, that you can prove with math. Because my feeling is like there's so many policies out there that the humans are the weakest link.
Yeah.
So if I can reason over 50% of my policies, and 50% of my policies still have to be reviewed manually, I can focus on saying, how do I reason over more and more of my policies? And so that the manual reviews, there might always be one-offs at some point, but we want to, in order to govern, I know I can really trust what I can reason over. And my governance strategy is going to be expand so I can reason over more and more of my infrastructure and my company's capabilities. What are your thoughts about that as a KPI?
Absolutely. I think the reasoning, right? Like, I'll add something to what you just said, right? Like with AI now, a lot of people are, moving towards leveraging AI, right? And it's conversational, it's prescriptive, and soon we're adding plugins to the identity, where you are executing things over, you know agents, right? And the information that's being broadcasted towards you, right? And then the biggest question always in terms of like, how do I believe, right? Like, so I go to all these conferences. The biggest things like, how can I trust an agent, or there's no human in the loop, right? But I think the reasoning, Mike, I think I agree with you, right? So even, if it's human, non-human AI, the reason on why a certain thing is done a certain way kind of builds that confidence, right? And you spoke about percentage, right? So that's where you can associate, based on the reasoning, you can associate that with a score or a percentage. This is why I feel 80% confident, right? And it's backed by, the reasoning I've got, right? And that translates to a true value, right? In terms of like, this is my confidence on my system, right? It'll be nice when somebody asks like, hey, how confident are you about your identity program, right? Or, you're not going to get breached, right? Somebody can put a number and say, I'm 80% there, 70% there. I'm working on the 30%, and these are 2 3 things I'm doing, but this is my reasoning behind it. And
Yeah,
these are my policies that are throwing the reasons.
yeah. Here's the 20% you still have to worry about, but 80% you can sleep well knowing that 80%.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. And
um,
being aware of the 20%, right? Like you're aware of the 20%, right? And,
right.
and you're putting mitigations, you're putting all the right guardrails to get there, and you know when you will get there.
And automating everything isn't necessarily the goal. I worked at a large financial services company, and we automated something, and then we unautomated it like a couple of months later because we're like, you know what? We want basically what we call a human in the loop today.
Yeah, because now you're not aware. You're just waiting for things to blow up if you automate everything, right? So you should always have that human in the loop, because you can catch it midway somewhere.
Yeah, you have to be thoughtful about it. There are times when humans are just like they're needed.
Yeah.
We're still good at some stuff. Um, last Tuesday, I did an episode on why AI is breaking IGA. No live stream is complete today unless we at least go a little bit into AI. So I guess my last question before we go to last thoughts is, what new challenges do you think AI is presenting, um, especially when it comes to, let's say, advisory work, where advisors can put into Claude Sonnet 4.5 some of these questions and maybe get back quite a sophisticated answer. What do you see as some of the new challenges, and how will that factor into or impact the work that you deliver through advisory?
Absolutely. So I think it's both good and bad, right? So from a challenge standpoint, I think everybody talks about it, right? The pace at which the bad actors can get at you, um, has multiplied, right? But also you can use the same AI to counter that, right? So you also have the right intelligence, right?
Sounds like an arms race.
Exactly. So and that is why that much more a role of an advisor who is aware of the industry, who is aware of the threat vectors in the industry, and who's aware of what they can be enabled with, and who's also aware of the technology that's out there that anybody can leverage to get at you, and who's also very self-aware of the digital ecosystem that they're working with, comes into play, right? So and this is not one person again, right? Like, so when we say an advisor, it's probably going to be a group of people, right, falling under advisory, and working in tandem, and don't work against AI, right? Leverage AI to counter the threats that AI can pose, right? And one singlest thing is like you're always taking the human away, right? Because it's agents versus agents, right? So how can you train your agent better than somebody else, right? Is what it's going to get to, right? And I'm actually excited about it.
Cool. So, last thoughts before we break?
I think identity as we stand is undergoing a great transformation, right, as we speak. And I am super excited, right? I'm super excited about how identity is getting evolved, and there is an absolute need for a purebred identity governance programs to safely secure, enable the businesses to do the right things, right? So I'm just excited that we're at the right place at the right time, and helping digital ecosystems be more secure.
Yeah, and I think that you're 100% right that this expertise in cybersecurity, especially the specialists who understand the identity and the access management, are really rare these days. And so yeah, I agree that it's essential to get the right advisory because doing the wrong thing, the transactions costs and the cost opportunity costs of doing the wrong thing are really high. So there's a very high ROI on establishing this right program to build the infrastructure. So I agree. Um,
Absolutely.
just quick announcement of the next episode. The agentic AI discussion continues next Tuesday, or I'm sorry, next week is IAW, Internet Identity Workshop. So there's no live streams next week, planned at least. Um, and so we come back the following Tuesday. Um, and so more talk on agentic AI stuff. And yeah, so I hope to see everyone at Internet Identity Workshop, or at least those who are lucky enough to be able to make it, or brave enough to brave air travel right now with the government shutdown. So I'm braving it. I'll be there. There's also the Friday Agentic Identity Workshop. So IAW is now 4 days, not 3 days. So it's a marathon. But hope to see you all there. And with that, I will say thank you so much, Pawan. It's been a great conversation. I appreciate you coming on and sharing your thoughts. And thank you, audience, for tuning in. And we'll see you next time.